Amy says, "So, it's no use to telephone anywhere, Harry. Haven't you seen Dr. Warburton? You know he's the oldest friend of the family, and he's known you longer than anybody, Harry. When he heard that you were going to be here for dinner, he broke an important engagement to come," Warburton says. "I dare say we've both changed a good deal, Harry. A country practitioner doesn't get younger. It takes me back longer than you can remember to see you again, but you can't have forgotten the day when you came back from school with measles, and we had such a time to keep us. It was unpleasant coming home to have an illness," Violet says. "It was always the same with your minor ailments and children's epidemics. You would never stay in bed because you were convinced that you would never get well," Harry says. "Not, I think, without some justification, for what you call restoration to health is the only incubation of another malady," Warburton says. "You mustn't take such a pessimistic view, which is hardly complimentary to my profession, but I remember when I was a student at Cambridge, I used to dream of making some great discovery to do away with one disease or another. Now I've had 40 years' experience. I've left off thinking in terms of the laboratory. We're all of us ill in one way or another. We call it health when we find no symptom of illness. Health is a relative term." Ivy says, "You must have had a very rich experience, Doctor, in 40 years, Warburton says. "Indeed, yes, even in a country practice. My first patient now, you wouldn't believe it, ladies, was a murderer who suffered from an incurable cancer. How he fought against it. I never saw a man more anxious to live." Probably because his conscience knew where he might be going, right? Harry says, "Not at all extraordinary. It is really harder to believe in murder than to believe in cancer. Cancer is here, the lump, the dull pain, the occasional sickness. Murder is a reversal of sleep and waking. Murder was there. Your ordinary murderer regards himself as an innocent victim. To himself, he is still what he used to be, or what he would be. He cannot realize that everything is irrevocable. The past, irredeemable, but cancer now, that is something real." Well, in the Shia point of view, and in the general Islamic point of view, one mistake of a type doesn't make a person, of that type. If you leave even misassociation, idolatry, whatever you're going to call it, if it's something done once and not returned to, and you have proper worship from then on or something, it's not your quality of being, right? One lie does not make somebody a liar. Unless it, is allowed that place in your character. Warburton says, "Well, let's not talk of such matters. How did we get onto the subject of cancer? I really don't know, but now you're all grown up. I haven't a patient left at Witchwood. Witchwood was always a cold place, but healthy. It's only when I get an invitation to dinner that I ever see your mother," Violet says. "Yes, look at your mother, except that she can't get about now in winter. You wouldn't think that she was a day older than on her birthday 10 years ago," Gerald says. "Is there any such use in waiting for Arthur and John?" Amy says. "We might as well go in to dinner. They may come before we finish. Will you take me, Doctor? I think we are very much the oldest present. In fact, we are the oldest inhabitants. As we came first, we will go first in to dinner," Warburton says. "With pleasure, Lady Monchensi. And I hope that next year will bring me the same honor." Exeunt Amy, Dr. Warburton, and Harry. And the chorus. "I am afraid of all that has happened, and of all that is to come, of the things to come that sit at the door are as if they had been there always, and the past is about to happen, and the future was long since settled, and the wings of the future darken the past, the beak and claws have desecrated, history shamed, the first cry in the bedroom, the noise in the nursery mutilated, the family album rendered ludicrous, the tenants' dinner, the family picnic on the moors have torn the roof from the house, or perhaps it was never there, and the bird sits on the broken chimney, I'm afraid, Ivy says. This is a most undignified terror, and I must struggle against it, Gerald says. I'm used to tangible danger, but only to what I can understand, Violet says. It's the obtuseness of Gerald and Charles that gets on my nerves, Charles says. If the matter were left in my hands, I think I could manage the situation. Exeunt and enters Mary and passes through to dinner, and Agatha enters and says, the eye is on the house. The eye covers it. There are 3 together. May the 3 be separated. May the knot that was tied become unknotted. May the crossed bones in the filled up well be at last straightened. May the weasel and the otter be about the proper business. The eye of the daytime and the eye of the nighttime be diverted from this house, till the knot is unknotted, the crossed is uncrossed, and the crooked is made straight. Part 2 is in the library after dinner. Scene 1. Harry and Warburton says, I'm glad of a few minutes alone with you, Harry. In fact, I had another reason for coming this evening. Then simply in honor of your mother's birthday, I wanted a private conversation with you on a confidential matter, Harry says. I can imagine, though I think it is probably going to be useless, or, if anything, make matters rather more difficult. But talk about it if you like. Warburton says, You don't understand me. I'm sure you cannot know what is on my mind. And as for making matters more difficult, it is much more difficult not to be prepared for something that is very likely to happen, Harry says. Oh God, man, the things that are going to happen have already happened, Warburton says. That is in a sense true, but without your knowing it. And what you know or do not know at any moment may make an endless difference to the future. It's about your mother, Harry says. What about my mother? Everything has always been referred back to mother. When we were children, before we went to school, the rule of conduct was simply pleasing mother. Misconduct was simply being unkind to mother. What was wrong was whatever made her suffer. Well, you really can't make anybody else suffer. You can put them through difficulty, but that's not the... And whatever made her happy was what was virtuous. Though never very happy, I remember. That's why we all felt like failures before we had begun. When we came back for the school holidays, they were not holidays, but simply a time in which we were supposed to make up to mother for all the weeks during which she had not seen us, except at half-term, and seeing us then only seemed to make her more unhappy, and made us feel more guilty. And so we misbehaved. Next day at school, in order to be punished, for punishment made us feel less guilty. Mother never punished us, but made us feel guilty. I think that the things that are taken for granted at home make a deeper impression upon children than what they are told. Warburton says, Stop, Harry. You're mistaken. I mean, you don't know what I want to tell you. You may be quite right, but what we are concerned with now is your mother's happiness in the future, or the time she has to live, not with the past, Harry says. Oh, is there any difference? How can we be concerned with the past and not with the future, or with the future and not with the past? What I'm telling you is very important, very important. You must let me explain, and then you can talk. I don't know why, but just this evening I feel an overwhelming need for explanation. But perhaps I only dream that I am talking, and shall wake to find that I have been silent, or talked to the stone deaf, and the others seem to hear something else than what I'm saying. If you want to talk, at least you can tell me something useful. Do you remember my father? Warburton says. Why, yes, of course, Harry. But I really don't see what that has to do with the present occasion. Or with what I have to tell you, Harry says. What you have to tell me is either something that I know already, or unimportant, or else untrue. But I want to know more about my father. I hardly remember him, and I know very well that I was kept apart from him till he went away. We never heard him mentioned, but in some way or another we felt that he was already here. But when we would have grasped for him, there was only a vacuum surrounded by whispering ants, Ivy and Violet. Agatha never came then. Where was my father? Warburton, Harry, there is no good probing for misery. There was enough once, but what festered then has only left a cautery. Leave it alone. We know that your mother and your father were never very happy together. They separated by mutual consent, and he went to live abroad. You were only a boy when he died. You would not remember. And Harry says, but now I remember, not Arthur or John. They were too young. But now I remember a summer day of unusual heat. The day I lost my butterfly net. I remember the silence, and the hushed excitement, and the low conversation of triumphant ants. It is the conversations not overheard, not intended to be heard, with the sidewise looks that bring death into the heart of a child. That was the day he died, of course. I mean, I suppose, the day on which the news arrived, Warburton says. You overinterpret. I am sure that your mother always loved him. There was never the slightest suspicion of scandal. Well, sometimes people don't violate their contracts to people merely just because of some sort of lack of love or something. Harry says, scandal? Who said scandal? I did not. Yes, I see now. That night when she kissed me, I felt the trap close. If you won't tell me, I must ask Agatha. I never dared before. Warburton says, I advise you strongly not to ask your aunt. I mean, there's nothing she could tell you, but Harry, we can't sit here all evening, you know. You will have to have the birthday celebration, and your brothers will be here. Won't you let me tell you what I had to say? And Harry says, very well, tell me. Warburton says, it's about your mother's health that I wanted to talk to you. I must tell you, Harry, that although your mother is still so alert, so vigorous of mind, although she seems so as vital as ever, it's only the force of her personality, her indomitable will, that keeps her alive. I needn't go into technicalities. At the present moment, the whole machine is weak and running down. Her heart's very feeble with care and avoiding all excitement. She may live several years. A sudden shock might send her off at any moment. If she had been another woman, she would not have lived until now. Her determination has kept her going. She has only lived for your return to Wishwood, for you to take command at Wishwood. And for that reason, it is most essential that nothing should disturb or excite her, Harry says. Well, Warburton says, I'm very sorry for you, Harry. I should have liked to spare you this just now. But there were two reasons why you had to know. One is your mother, to make her happy for the time she has to live. The other is for yourself. The future of Wishwood depends on you. I don't like to say this, but you know that I am a very old friend, and have always been a party to the family secrets. You know very well as I do that Arthur and John have been a great disappointment to your mother. John's very steady, but he's not exactly brilliant, and Arthur has always been rather irresponsible. Your mother's hopes are all centered on you. Harry says, hopes, tell me. Did you know my father at About my present age? And Warburton says, why, yes, Harry, of course I did. And Harry says, what did he look like then? Did he look like at all like me? Warburton says, very much like you. Of course, there are differences, but allowing for the changes in fashion, you're being clean-shaven, very much like you. And now, Harry, let's talk about yourself. Harry says, I never saw a photograph. There is no portrait. Warburton says, what I want to know is whether you've been sleeping. And Denman enters and says, it's Sergeant Winchell is here, my lord, and wants to see your lordship very urgent. And Dr. Warburton, he says it's very urgent, or he wouldn't have troubled you. Harry says, I'll see him. And Denman exits, and Warburton says, I wonder what he wants. I hope nothing has happened to either of your brothers. Harry says, nothing can have happened to either of my brothers. Nothing can happen. Sergeant Winchell is real, but Denman saw him. But what if Denman saw him, and yet he was not real? That would be worse than anything that has happened. What if you saw him and... Warburton says, Harry, pull yourself together. Something may have happened to one of your brothers. And Winchell enters and says, good evening, my lord. Good evening, doctor. Many happy... Oh, I'm sorry, my lord. I was thinking it was your birthday, not her ladyship's. Harry says, her ladyship's? He darts at Winchell and seizes him by the shoulders. He is real, doctor. Well, there's different types of real, and not all of them are physical, right? So let us resume the conversation. You and I and Winchell, sit down, Winchell, and have a glass of port. We were talking of my father, Winchell says. Always at your jokes, I see. You don't look a year older than when I saw you last, my lord. But a country sergeant doesn't get younger. Thank you, no, my lord. I don't find port agrees with the rheumatism. And nowadays, there's a lot of food additives that don't agree with it either, or even cause it. Warburton says, for God's sake, Winchell, tell us your business. His lordship isn't very well this evening. Winchell says, I understand, sir. It'd be the same if it was my birthday. I beg pardon. I'm forgetting. If it was my mother, God rest her soul, she's been dead these 10 years, how is her ladyship? If I may ask, my lord. Harry says, why do you keep asking about her ladyship? Do you know or don't you know? I'm not afraid of you. Winchell says, I should hope not, my lord. I didn't mean to put myself forward. But you see, my lord, I had a good reason for asking. Harry says, well, do you want me to produce her for you? Winchell says, oh, no, indeed, my lord. I'd much rather not. Harry says, you mean to think I can't? But I might surprise you. I think I might be able to give you a shock. Winchell says, there's been shock enough for one evening, my lord. That's what I've come about. Warburton says, for heaven's sake, Winchell, tell us your business. Winchell says, it's about Mr. John. Harry says, John? Winchell says, yes, my lord, I'm sorry. I thought I'd better have a word with you quiet rather than phone and perhaps disturb her ladyship. So I slipped along my bike, mostly waking, what with the fog so thick, or I'd have been here sooner. I'd telephoned to Dr. Warburton's, and they told me he was here and that he'd arrived. Mr. Johns had a bit of an accident on the west road in the fog, coming along. At a pretty smart pace, I fancy. Ran into a lorry, drawn up around the bend. We'll have the driver up for this. Says he doesn't know this part of the country, and stopped to take his bearings. We've got him at the Arms. Mr. John, I mean, by a bit of luck, Dr. Owen was there and looked him over. Says there's nothing wrong but some nasty cuts and a bad concussion. Says he'll come around in the morning most likely, but he mustn't be moved. But Dr. Owen was quite anxious that you should have a look at him. Warburton says, quite right. Quite right. I'll go and have a look at him. You must explain to your mother. And Amy says, Harry, Harry. Who's there with you? Is it Arthur or John? And she enters, followed by Violet, Ivy, Agatha, Gerald, and Charles. Winchell, what are you here for? Winchell says, I'm sorry, my lady, but I have just told the doctor it's really nothing but a minor accident. Well, that's sort of like a major accident, really, but, you know, or else he could be moved and all that. Warburton says, it's John has had the accident, Lady Montmorency. And Winchell tells me Dr. Owen has seen him and says it's nothing but a slight concussion, but he mustn't be moved tonight. I'd trust Owen on a matter like this. You can trust Owen. We'll bring him up tomorrow, and a few days' rest, I've no doubt, will be all he needs. And Amy says, accident? What sort of accident? Winchell says, coming along in the fog, my lady. And he must have been rather in a hurry. There was a lorry drawn up where it shouldn't have been, outside of the village, on the west road. And he says, where is he? Winchell says, at the Arms, my lady. Of course. He hasn't come round yet. Dr. Owen was there by a bit of luck. Gerald says, I'll go down and see him, Amy, and come back and report to you. Amy says, I must see for myself. Order the car at once. Warburton says, I forbid it, Lady Montmorency. As your doctor, I forbid you to leave the house tonight. There is nothing you could do, and out in this weather, at this time of night, I would not answer for the consequences. I am going myself. I will come back and report to you. Amy says, I must see for myself. I do not believe you. Charles says, much better leave it to Warburton, Amy. Extremely fortunate for us that he's here. We must put ourselves under Warburton's orders. Warburton says, I repeat, Lady Montmorency, that you must not go out. If you do, I must decline to continue to treat you. You are only delaying me. I shall return at once. Amy says, well, I suppose you are right. But can I trust you? Warburton says, you have trusted me a good many years, Lady Montmorency. This is not the time to begin to doubt me. Come, Winchell. We can put your bicycle on the back of my car. And Exeunt, Warburton, and Winchell. And Violet says, well, Harry, I think that you might have had something to say. Aren't you sorry for your brother? Aren't you aware of what is going on and what it means to your mother? And Harry says, oh, of course I'm sorry, but from what Winchell says, I don't think the matter can be very serious. A minor trouble like a concussion cannot make very much difference to John. A brief vacation from the kind of consciousness that John enjoys can't make very much difference to him or anyone else. If he was ever really conscious, I should be glad for him to have a breathing spell, but John's ordinary day isn't much more than breathing. Ivy says, really, Harry, how can you be so callous? I always thought you were so fond of John, Violet says. And if you don't care what happens to John, you might show some consideration to your mother, Amy says. I do not know very much, and as I get older, I am coming to think how little I have ever known. But I think your remarks are much more inappropriate than Harry's. And Harry says, it is only when they see nothing that people can always show the suitable emotions, and so far as they feel at all, their emotions are suitable. They don't understand what it is to be awake, to be living on several planes at once. Though one cannot speak with several voices at once, I have all the right-minded feeling about John that you consider appropriate. Only, that's not the language that I choose to be talking. I will not talk yours, and Amy says. You looked like your father when you said that. Harry says, I think, Mother, I shall make you lie down. You must be very tired. And Harry and Amy leave. And Violet says, I really do not understand Harry's behavior. Agatha says, I think It is as well to leave Harry to establish, if he can, some communication with his mother. Violet says, I do not seem to be very popular tonight. Charles says, well, there's no sort of use in any of us going on a night like this. It's a good 3 miles. There's nothing we could do that Warburton can't. If he's worse than Winchell said, then he'll let us know at once, Gerald says. I'm really more afraid of the shock for Amy, but I think that Warburton understands that. Ivy says, you are quite right, Gerald. The one thing that matters is not to let her see that anyone is worried. We must carry on as if nothing had happened, and have the cake and presents, Gerald says. But I am worried about Arthur. He's much more apt than John to get into trouble. Charles says, oh, but Arthur's a brilliant driver. After all the experience he's had at Brooklands, he's not likely to get into trouble. And Gerald says, a brilliant driver, but more reckless, Ivy says. Yet I remember when they were boys, Arthur was always the more adventurous, but John was the one that had the accidents. Somehow, just because he was the slow one, he was always the one to fall off the pony, or out of the tree, and always on his head, Violet says. But a year ago, Arthur took me out in his car, and I told him I would never go out with him again. Not that I wanted to go with him at all, though of course he meant well, but I think an open car is so undignified. If you're blown about so, and you feel so conspicuous, lolling back, and so near the street, and everyone's staring, and the pace he went at was simply terrifying. I said I would rather walk, and I did. And Gerald says, walk? Where to? Violet says, he started out to take me to Cheltenham, but I stopped him somewhere in Chiswick, I think. Anyway, the district was familiar, and I had the greatest trouble in getting home. I am sure he meant well, but I do think he is reckless, Gerald says. I wonder how much Amy knows about Arthur. Charles says, more than she cares to mention, I imagine. And Harry enters and says, Mother is asleep, I think. It's strange how the old can drop off to sleep in the middle of calamity. Like children are hardened campaigners. She looked very much as she must have looked when she was a child. You've been holding a meeting, the usual family inquest, on the characters of all the junior members, are engaged in predicting the minor event, engaged in foreseeing the minor disaster. You go on trying to think of each thing separately, making small things important, so that everything may be unimportant, a slight deviation from some imaginary course that life ought to take, that you call normal. What you call the normal is merely the unreal and the unimportant. It was like that in a way, so long as I could think, even of my own life as an isolated ruin, a casual bit of waste in an orderly universe. But it begins to seem just part of some huge disaster, some monstrous mistake and aberration of all men of the world which I cannot put in order. If you only knew the years that I have had to live since I came home a few hours ago to Witchwood. Violet says, I will make no observation on what you say, Harry. My comments are not always welcome in this family. And Denman enters and says, excuse me, Miss Ivy, there's a trunk call for you. Ivy says, a trunk call for me? Why? Who could want me? Denman says, he wouldn't give his name, miss, but it's Mr. Arthur. Ivy says, Arthur? Oh dear, I'm afraid he's had an accident. And Ivy and Denman exit, and Violet says, when it's Ivy that he's asking for, I expect the worst. Agatha says, whatever you have learned, Harry, you must remember that there is always more. We cannot rest in being the impatient spectators of malice or stupidity. We must try to penetrate the other private worlds, or make believe and fear. To rest in our own suffering is the evasion of suffering. We must learn to suffer more. Violet said, well, I'm in some way of speaking, suffering is like something a little bit different than just hardship. It's making things worse with one's judgment. So, Violet says, Agatha's remarks are invariably pointed. Harry says, do you think that I believe what I said just now? That was only what I should like to believe. I was talking in abstractions, and you answered in abstractions. Were they simply inside? I could cheat them perhaps with the aid of Dr. Warburton or any other doctor who would be another Warburton. If you decided to set another doctor on me, but this is too real for your words to alter. There must be another way of talking that would get us somewhere. You don't understand me. You can't understand me. It's not being alone. Lies a little deeper, and Ivy enters and says, "Where is there an evening paper?" Gerald says, "Why, what's the matter?" Ivy says, "Somebody look for Arthur in the evening paper." That was Arthur ringing up from London. The connection was so bad I could hardly hear him. And his voice was very queer. It seems that Arthur, too, has had an accident. I don't think he's hurt, but he says that he hasn't got the use of his car, and he missed the last train, so he's coming up tomorrow. And he said there was something about it in the paper, but it's all a mistake. And not to tell his mother, Violet says, "What's the use of asking for the evening paper? You know as well as I do, at this distance from London, nobody's likely to have this evening's paper." Charles says, "Stop. I think I bought a lunch edition before I left St. Pancras. If I did, it's in my overcoat." And let us remember the simple fact. I'll see if it's there. There might be something in that. So let us remember that duty to family does not include what's wrong or what's not fair. So, I mean, one can say no when it comes to certain things, right? And Gerald says, "Well, I said that to Arthur was every bit as likely to have an accident as John, and it wasn't John's fault. I don't believe John is unlucky, but Arthur is definitely reckless." "I'm glad to say it's not very conspicuous," Gerald says. "There'll have been more in the latter editions." "You'd better read it to us," Charles reads. "Piers, brother, and motor smash. The Hon, Arthur, Gerald, Charles Piper, younger brother of Lord Monchensi, who ran into and demolished a roundsman's cart in Edbury Street early on the morning of January 1st, was fined $50 and costs today and forbidden to drive a car for the next 12 months. While trying to extricate his car from the collision, Mr. Piper reversed into a shop window. When challenged, Mr. Piper said, 'I thought it was all open country about here.'"